You're not gonna believe what happened in that courtroom. A young black woman, arrested for peacefully protesting, stood in front of a judge, and without warning, an officer shaved her head bald right there in public. No crime, no conviction, just pure humiliation. But what they didn't expect? She'd come back years later, wearing a judge's robe, holding the gavel, and facing the same officer who once tried to break her. If you're tired of stories where we lose, stick around. Subscribe now because this channel is where our people rise. It began with a moment so cruel, so raw, and so needlessly humiliating that it sent shivers through the hearts of everyone who heard about it, especially on Chicago's South Side, where pain like this isn't new, but still cuts deep every time. Picture this. A bright young black woman named Aaliyah Jefferson standing silently in a packed courtroom, surrounded by cold walls, bored onlookers, and flickering fluorescent lights that seemed to mock her every breath. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't on trial. She hadn't been convicted of anything. She had been arrested for something as simple and as powerful as protesting, for daring to raise her voice against the killing of her brother, for holding a sign outside a police station that read, "I am my brother's keeper." She was peaceful. She was grieving. But in a world that often sees black pain as a threat, that was enough. And as she stood there, in the one place that was supposed to offer fairness and justice, something happened that not even the cruelest parts of her mind could have imagined. A white officer named Daniel Riker, with a hard jaw and a harder heart, approached her slowly. In his hand, a pair of electric clippers. No one said a word. Not the judge, not the bailiffs, not the crowd. It was like time froze just to witness the horror. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He didn't pause. With mechanical precision, he pressed the buzzing clippers to her scalp and began shaving her head bald. Right there, in public. No warrant, no protocol, no legal justification. Just a deliberate, humiliating act meant to strip her of her identity, her dignity, and her strength. Her long, beautiful braids fell to the courtroom floor like leaves off a dying tree, and with each strand that hit the ground, her tears welled deeper, but she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of every injustice her skin had already known. The room was silent, but the buzzing echoed like thunder. And that moment, it didn't just change Aaliyah. It marked her. It branded her with a pain that would burn for years, but it also lit something else inside her, a flame she didn't even know she had. What Officer Riker didn't realize in that moment was that he wasn't shaving away her power. He was igniting it. He was forging something unbreakable. Because Aaliyah didn't disappear after that day, even though many expected her to. She vanished from the public eye, yes, but not to retreat. She went underground to heal, to regroup, to fight in silence. She filed a lawsuit, a long, grueling civil rights case that dug deep into the dirt of Riker's past, uncovering a trail of complaints, misconduct, and racially charged abuse that had been ignored for years. And while that case crawled through the broken legal system, Aaliyah was doing something else. She was studying, she was working, she was rebuilding. She got into law school, not just any school. She earned a scholarship to one of the toughest programs in the country. And she didn't just survive it, she crushed it, top of her class. Every paper, every exam, every courtroom internship she tackled with the quiet fury of someone who had felt justice fail her and vowed never to let it fail someone else. While others partied, she read case files. While others slept, she wrote briefs. And all the while, that buzz, that awful sound of clippers against her scalp, echoed in her memory like a war drum, reminding her of why she started. She didn't tell her story to many. She let her work speak. And slowly, whispers about her began to spread in legal circles. A brilliant young mind, a fierce advocate for the voiceless, a woman who understood the system because she had once been chewed up by it. Then came the day no one could have predicted. A nomination. A judgeship. In the very same courthouse where she'd once been broken in front of strangers, Aaliyah Jefferson was being asked to return. This time, wearing a black robe, holding a gavel, and deciding the fate of others. Some called it poetic justice, others called it impossible. But Aaliyah didn't care what they called it. She accepted. And on the day of her swearing in, the crowd that once gasped in pity now watched in awe. She entered that courtroom not as a victim, not as a protester, but as the law. Her head? Still shaved, now by choice, now a crown. Her eyes? Fierce and calm. Her presence? Unshakable. And seated in the front row, almost as if fate demanded it, was none other than Officer Daniel Riker. This time he was the one being judged. A long list of civil rights violations, racial misconduct, and abuse of power had finally caught up with him. His smirk was gone, his confidence shattered. And as he stood to face the judge, he realized with chilling clarity that the woman he, once humiliated, now held the power to end his career, to sentence him, to stare him down and decide his fate. Aaliyah didn't gloat, she didn't seek revenge. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and devastating. She looked him in the eye and said, "This courtroom was once a place where I was stripped of my dignity. Today it becomes a place where dignity is restored, not just for me but for every woman who's been silenced, every person of color who's been degraded by those sworn to protect them." The room fell dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. And Riker? He looked like a man who had finally seen himself through the eyes of the people he'd hurt. His sentence came swiftly. He was stripped of his badge, found guilty of multiple counts, and sentenced for violating civil rights. But Aaliyah's mission didn't end there. She used her platform to launch an initiative called Voices from the Bench, a program to help young women of color not just survive the legal system, but rise through it, lead in it, and transform it from the inside out. Her story spread far beyond Chicago. It became a symbol, a reminder that no matter how deep the pain, how public the humiliation, or how broken the system may seem, there is always power in rising. And Aaliyah Jefferson? She didn't just rise. She roared. She proved that even when the world tries to strip you down to nothing, you can still rebuild yourself stronger than they ever imagined. Because justice isn't just about punishment. It's about redemption, restoration, and the unshakable power of one woman refusing to be defined by her worst moment. And now, every time someone enters that courtroom, they don't just see a judge. They see a survivor, a warrior, a reminder that sometimes the person you tried to destroy becomes the very person who decides your fate. Aaliyah Jefferson's story didn't begin in a courtroom. It began on the cracked sidewalks of Englewood, a neighborhood in Chicago known more for its sirens than its success stories, a place where dreams were often outnumbered by police cars, and where hope, if you had any, had to be earned every single day. Born into a world where poverty wasn't just economic but emotional, Aaliyah's life was shaped by hardship before she could even spell the word. But her mother, a woman with tired hands, wise eyes, and an iron spirit, taught her something more valuable than money: dignity. "They can take your clothes, your job, your freedom," her mother would say, "but they can't take how you walk through this world unless you let them." Aaliyah listened. She watched. She learned. Even as a child, she was different, quiet, observant, brilliant in a way that made teachers pause. She devoured books like meals, asked questions no one else dared, and always carried herself like she had somewhere important to be, even if she didn't yet. But no amount of intelligence could shield her from the storm. The world didn't care that she was gifted. It only cared that she was black and poor and from Englewood. At 15, her world cracked wide open when her older brother Jamal, her protector and best friend, was gunned down by police during what they called a routine stop. They said he reached for something. They said they feared for their lives. But Aaliyah knew the only thing Jamal reached for was his wallet, and maybe his dignity. His death lit something dark inside her. Not rage, not at first. Just a deep silence, a heavy grief that followed her like a shadow. She stopped talking in class. She stopped smiling. But she didn't stop moving forward. At 17, another blow. Falsely accused of shoplifting from a downtown convenience store. No evidence, no witnesses, Just a hunch from a clerk who thought she looked suspicious. The police were quick. Too quick. She was handcuffed before she could speak, processed before she could breathe, and locked in juvenile detention for 3 long nights. The cell was cold. The silence was worse. No one came to explain. No one said sorry when the charges were dropped. But Aaliyah learned something important in those nights, how it felt to be invisible, how the system didn't just fail people like her, it designed itself to trap them. And yet, she didn't collapse. She studied harder, worked late nights, at a corner store, wrote essays by candlelight when the electricity was cut. She got into community college, her first escape, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was hers. She cleaned houses during the day and read law textbooks at night, obsessed with understanding the rules of a game she'd been forced to play since childhood. Her professors noticed her hunger. One helped her apply for a scholarship. The University of Chicago said yes. She cried when she got the letter, not because she doubted herself, but because for once the door didn't slam in her face. On campus, she felt like a ghost, surrounded by students who'd never seen a city block like hers, who'd never lost a brother to gunfire or spent a night in a cell. But she didn't care. She stayed focused, wore her silence like armor, and kept reminding herself, I'm here for a reason. But then came the protest, the moment she stepped from silence into voice. It wasn't violent, it wasn't chaotic, it was a peaceful gathering outside a police station, candles and signs, chants and prayers. Aaliyah held one that said, I am my brother's keeper. It was simple, honest, and enough to get her arrested. They said she was obstructing. She was processed again. But the real violation came later, in a courtroom that was supposed to be the heart of justice but instead beat like a machine with no soul. She stood in front of the judge, nervous but proud. She hadn't done anything wrong. She believed in that. But then Officer Daniel Riker stepped forward. A man whose reputation whispered things long before he spoke. A man who had filed complaint after complaint against black defendants, each one brushed aside. He claimed Aaliyah's braided hair was a security threat. There was no law, no policy. Just a nod from the judge, his friend, and a silence that told everyone else to keep quiet. He pulled out clippers. Real ones. Electric. Buzzing. And before she could react, before anyone could stop it, he stepped forward and pressed them to her scalp, in front of the entire courtroom. Aaliyah froze. She didn't cry, not right away. She just stood there, rooted by disbelief as the clippers ripped through her identity. Her braids fell one by one to the cold tile floor. The buzzing sound was louder than her heartbeat. She couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The humiliation was so public, so brutal, so unnecessary, it felt like a scar being etched into her soul. The courtroom didn't gasp. No one objected. And that silence, more than the clippers, broke something inside her. When it was over, she walked out different, not defeated, just changed. For a while, she vanished. No social media, no statements. People thought she'd given up. But Aaliyah wasn't gone. She was evolving, healing, planning. She filed a lawsuit that dragged for years, peeling back the layers of corruption that protected men like Riker. But she didn't stop there. She went back to school, law school this time. And every time she doubted herself, she remembered the sound of the clippers, the feel of the courtroom's silence, the shame on her mother's face when she came home bald. That shame didn't crush her, it fueled her. She studied harder than anyone, graduated top of her class, took cases no one else wanted, fought for women like her, voiceless, afraid, but not broken. Her name started to mean something in legal circles. Not just a survivor, a force. And then, one day, the unbelievable happened. She was nominated to be a judge in the very same courthouse that had once tried to destroy her. People were shocked. Some tried to block it. But the momentum was too strong. She was too strong. On the day she walked back into that courtroom, every head turned. This time she wore a robe. This time, her shaved head was her choice. A crown, not a scar. And in the front row? Officer Riker, facing charges, stripped of power. He looked up, and for the first time in his career, he saw a face he couldn't intimidate. She sat where he once stood. The room was silent again, but this time the silence belonged to her. Because Aaliyah Jefferson didn't just survive the system, she rewrote the rules. And she did it all without losing the one thing they tried to take from her, the way she carried herself. It was supposed to be a routine pretrial hearing, quiet and procedural, just another name on the docket. But what happened that day would forever stain the walls of that courtroom and ignite a story no one could have seen coming. Aaliyah Jefferson, only 22 years old at the time, stood in handcuffs, her back straight, her spirit bruised but unbroken, having been arrested for the crime of standing still with a sign that read, "I am my brother's keeper." It was a peaceful protest, one of many she'd attended since the death of her older brother at the hands of police. This one outside the very station that had tried to erase her family's pain with a press release and a shrug. There was no shouting, no violence, just silence, signs, and candles flickering in the night. But for Officer Daniel Riker, a man whose badge had long served as a shield for unchecked aggression, her presence was too loud, her message too bold, and her dignity too threatening. So they arrested her. On what grounds? They barely offered one. Obstruction, they said, though anyone watching knew it was retaliation. Retaliation for not staying in her place. Retaliation for remembering her brother's name. But what no one could have prepared for was what happened after. The quiet horror that unfolded inside that courtroom where justice was supposed to live. Aaliyah was let in wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit, wrists bound, her long braids cascading over her shoulders, a style she wore not just as fashion, but as identity, as culture, as connection to her roots. The room was unusually crowded, the kind of curious audience that came to court not for justice, but for spectacle. Fluorescent lights buzzed above like flies, harsh and unforgiving. The judge, a man in his 60s with a reputation for leniency toward law enforcement and a long history of golf outings with Officer Riker, barely looked up as Aaliyah was brought in. She stood tall, quiet, not defiant, but determined to hold on to whatever shred of dignity she still had left. Then came the moment no one could have anticipated. Riker stepped forward, holding a pair of electric clippers. He claimed that Aaliyah's hair posed a security threat, that it could conceal weapons or contraband, even though she'd already been searched. He said it with no conviction, no real explanation, just a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, as if daring anyone in the room to challenge him. The judge didn't blink, didn't ask for legal precedent, didn't check policy. He just gave the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for something else if it hadn't unleashed what came next. Without a single word to Aaliyah, without a court order, without the presence of any female officer or medical personnel, Riker walked up to her slowly, deliberately, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Aaliyah flinched, not out of fear but disbelief. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. No one stood up. No one moved. Time seemed to slow down as the buzzing sound of the clippers filled the room, a cruel hum that grew louder with every step Riker took. She didn't have time to speak, to object, to process. He reached forward, grabbed one of her thick, beautiful braids, and pressed the clippers to her scalp. The first braid hit the floor with a soft thud, a sound no one should ever hear in a courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A few people looked away. Some stared in frozen horror. But the judge, the court officers, silent, complicit. Aaliyah stood frozen, her body tense, her lips trembling, her eyes wide but dry, as if her tear ducts refused to grant Riker the satisfaction. The clippers buzzed again and again, each pass erasing more than just hair. They stripped away her sense of self, her history, her pride. Her scalp was scraped raw in places, the clippers tearing through without care. She was no longer a defendant. She was a symbol of how easily the system could dehumanize someone for daring to demand justice. Her head fell slightly as the final strands dropped to the floor. It wasn't just a haircut. It was an assault, a public execution of her identity under the guise of protocol. When Riker stepped back, satisfied, he didn't even look at her. He handed the clippers to another officer like it was just another tool, just another day. The judge moved on to the next case. No record was made, no order was written. It was as if it had never happened, except to Aaliyah. She was escorted out of the room, her scalp exposed, burning and bare, her pride buried beneath the clippings, scattered on the cold tile floor. The moment shattered something inside her. Not her will, that remained intact, but her faith. Faith in the system, faith in decency, faith in the idea that being right was enough. But somewhere deep within that heartbreak, something else ignited. A quiet, relentless fire. Because humiliation, when met with courage, can become fuel. And what Riker didn't know, what no one in that courtroom suspected, was that he hadn't broken Aaliyah Jefferson. He had transformed her. In that moment of raw vulnerability, she made a vow. Not out loud, not with words, but deep in her spirit. She would return, not just to fight, but to win. She would not be defined by that single act of cruelty. She would define herself. She would finish her education. She would go to law school. She would learn every rule they used to justify her suffering. And then she would change the rules. Because one day, she would walk back into that courtroom, not as a victim, but as the one who decides what justice looks like. And when she did, the buzzing of the clippers would be replaced by the sound of a gavel. Her tears would be replaced by power, and every person who ever doubted her would have no choice but to remember. The woman they tried to humiliate had become the very face of justice they could no longer ignore. After the day she was humiliated in the courtroom, Aaliyah vanished from the public eye, leaving many to believe that she had been broken. But what they didn't know was that this was just the beginning of her journey, a journey far more powerful than anyone could have predicted. What they couldn't see was the fierce determination burning in her heart, the quiet storm of resolve building inside her. Far from giving up, Aaliyah was healing. Quietly, privately. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but it was a road she was willing to walk. Behind closed doors, she filed a civil rights lawsuit against Officer Daniel Riker and the justice system that had allowed his cruelty to go unchecked. The legal battle was grueling, with years of delays, dismissals, and bureaucratic red tape designed to wear her down, to silence her once and for all. But Aaliyah wasn't the type to back down. She wasn't going to let her fight be drowned out by the weight of a broken system. The more time passed, the more it became clear that the case was exposing a much darker reality than just Riker's actions. It was showing the deep-rooted corruption in the system that allowed people like him to act with impunity. During this period, Aaliyah didn't sit idle. Instead, she focused all her energy on her education, something that had always been her anchor. She enrolled in law school, determined to learn every rule, every loophole, every strategy that could help her fight back, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence, just as she had. Every day she poured herself into her studies, driven by the painful memory of the buzzing clippers, the laughter that still echoed in her ears, and the knowledge that the system had failed her at every turn. She studied harder than anyone else, refusing to be outworked, motivated by the ghosts of her past, and the haunting belief that one day she would stand in the courtroom again, not as a victim, but as someone who would rewrite the rules of justice. Her tenacity paid off. Aaliyah graduated from law school at the top of her class, with honors and accolades that her former detractors never expected to see. But Aaliyah didn't stop there. She knew that her purpose was bigger than just earning a degree. She wasn't content with just helping herself. She wanted to help others too, the ones who didn't have the resources or the voice to fight back. She began working pro bono for women who had been silenced by a system that viewed them as expendable. Those who had been dismissed, disrespected, and abused by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. These women were often poor, often people of color, often without power. And yet, they were the ones Aaliyah saw herself in. Every case she took on, every woman she helped, was another step toward her goal, to restore dignity, to demand respect, and to show that no one, no matter how powerless they appeared, was beyond saving. As Aaliyah's reputation as a fierce and compassionate lawyer grew, so did the whispers. The same courtroom that had once looked at her with pity and disdain now began to murmur her name with respect, even fear. People saw her as an unstoppable force, a woman who had survived the worst and come back stronger, a woman who wasn't afraid to take on the system, to challenge the powerful, and to expose the truth. It was then, in the midst of her growing success, that something incredible happened. The very courthouse that had witnessed her humiliation years before, the very space where she had been reduced to nothing but a symbol of powerlessness, nominated her to be a judge. It seemed impossible. Aaliyah herself couldn't believe it at first. But it was real. After everything she had endured, after the struggle, after the years of fighting both the legal system and her own doubts, she was now being given a chance to sit on the other side of the bench, to be the one who made the decisions, to be the one who could finally give a voice to the voiceless. She had become a force, not just in her community, but in the legal world itself. The moment was surreal, and yet it was a culmination of everything she had fought for, not just for justice for herself, but for the many who had been forgotten, overlooked, and mistreated. It was a testament to her resilience, to her refusal to be silenced, to her unwavering belief that no matter how low the world pushed her, she would always rise. But being nominated was just the beginning. It meant facing a world that would never see her as the same person she had once been, a world that would question her every decision, doubt her every move, and try to undermine her at every turn. And yet Aaliyah was unshaken. She knew that her work wasn't just about getting into that courtroom. It was about changing the very fabric of what it meant to be a judge, to be a lawyer, to be someone who could create a system where justice was not just a word, but a reality for all. This wasn't just her redemption. This was the moment she could make sure no one else ever had to suffer the way she had. The day she would sit in that judge's seat, with the gavel in her hand, would not just mark the end of her journey, it would be the beginning of a new era of justice. The day Aaliyah Jefferson walked into that courtroom again, everything had changed. This time it wasn't her head shaved in shame, but in defiance, a bold statement of survival, resilience, and transformation. As she stepped into the room, donning the black robe of a judge, every head in the room turned and the atmosphere shifted. Some of those present stared at her with admiration, as they knew her story, knew the depths of her journey, and the power she now embodied. Others, however, felt shame flood their veins, for they recognized the woman who had once been stripped of her dignity by the very system they had sworn to uphold. The silence in the room was thick and palpable, for Aaliyah's presence commanded it. She no longer carried the weight of fear, the fear that had once been embedded in her spirit, the fear that had been born that fateful day in the courtroom, when she was humiliated before the world. Now, she was free from that fear, standing tall and strong, no longer the broken woman that they had tried to make her into. Her head, still shaved, now by choice, became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of unyielding strength. It was a reminder that she had fought back, that she had transformed. The pain into power, the humiliation into hope. As she made her way to the bench, Aaliyah noticed a familiar face in the front row, Officer Daniel Riker. The same officer who had once stood next to her, holding the clippers that shaved her head, was now sitting there, accused of misconduct, in multiple cases. His role in her story had come full circle, and now he was the one in the hot seat awaiting his own fate. He had been a man of arrogance, a man who thought himself untouchable, who used his badge to instill fear and exert power. But now, as Aaliyah walked into the courtroom, it was clear that the tables had turned. She was no longer the young woman who had been reduced to nothing by his actions. She was now the one with the gavel, the one who could decide his future. As Aaliyah took her seat, she caught Riker's gaze across the room. She could see the moment the smirk faded from his face. She could feel the change in the air as he realized, in that instant, that the woman he had humiliated was now in control. No longer could he hide behind his badge. No longer could he use his authority to silence those who opposed him. He was no longer the powerful one. That power had shifted. And as he sat there, nervous, trembling, Aaliyah didn't need to say a word to make him understand the gravity of the situation. She simply looked at him. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and piercing. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened, every tear she had shed, every injustice she had suffered, every battle she had fought. The room seemed to hold its breath as Aaliyah's eyes locked with his. In that single moment, she reminded him of something he had long forgotten. True power isn't something you can take from someone else. True power comes from within, from the ability to rise above and transform yourself, to take the very things meant to break you and turn them into your greatest strength. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smirk. In its place, Riker was left with the cold, hard truth. The woman he had tried to break was now the one who held the power to break him. And as Aaliyah sat there, the gavel resting in front of her, she knew this moment was more than just about Riker. It wasn't about vengeance or revenge. It was about justice. It was about proving that no one is ever truly defeated, unless they allow themselves to be. It was about showing the world that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who have been through the darkest times and come out the other side even stronger. As the proceedings began, Aaliyah felt the full weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This was no longer just a courtroom. This was a place where power was being redefined. This was a place where the system that had once sought to silence her was now being held accountable. She looked around the room, knowing that everything had led to this moment. The courtroom where she had been humiliated, where she had been broken, was now the place where she would make sure that no one else would ever suffer the same fate. Riker's defense was weak, his claims desperate. He tried to justify his actions, attempting to spin a narrative that painted him as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence was clear. The witnesses were compelling. And Aaliyah, in her calm, steady voice, made sure that Riker knew exactly why he was there. She didn't need to raise her voice or use theatrics. All she had to do was speak the truth. Her words cut through the room like a sharp blade. "This courtroom was once a place where I was stripped of my dignity," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Today, it becomes a place where dignity is restored. Not just for me, but for every person who has been degraded, for every person who has been targeted, for every person who has been denied justice simply because of who they are." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though time stood still. Riker, sitting there in front of her, was no longer the man in power. His face had turned pale, his earlier confidence shattered. He knew, in that moment, that he had no way out. Aaliyah's words had pierced through his defenses, exposing him for what he truly was. A man who had misused his authority, a man who had abused his power for far too long. And now, in this very courtroom, he would be held accountable. The room was silent, every person present recognizing the power of Aaliyah's transformation, the incredible journey she had taken to get to this point. What had once been a place of fear and humiliation for her had now become the stage for her greatest victory. In the end, Riker was stripped of his badge and sentenced for civil rights violations. But for Aaliyah, the true victory wasn't in his punishment. It was in the power she had taken back. It was in the moment when she had walked into that courtroom as a judge, no longer a victim, no longer broken, but a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up and who now had the power to shape the future. And as the gavel came down, the sound echoed through the room, loud and clear, a declaration of justice, a declaration of change. Aaliyah Jefferson had arrived. Riker's attempts to justify his actions, his claims of protocol and safety, were nothing more than desperate defenses that couldn't stand up to the evidence against him. The courtroom, once a place where his word was law, now saw through his thin excuses. The testimony was damning. Witness after witness spoke of Riker's history of abusing his power, targeting black women with unnecessary strip searches and intimidation, using his badge as a tool to degrade and humiliate those who couldn't fight back. As the witnesses spoke, their voices shaking with the weight of their own experiences, the room grew tense. But then, it was Aaliyah's turn. She didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. Her presence alone held the room captive. She rose from the bench, all eyes locked onto her. This wasn't the woman who had once been the victim. This was a woman who had transcended that identity, who had taken the pieces of herself that others had tried to destroy and forged them into something powerful. She wasn't a victim now. She was a judge, the very person with the power to shape this moment. Aaliyah's words, when they came, were calm but unyielding, steady but filled with unspoken fury. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice cut through the room, precise and piercing. This courtroom was once a place where I was stripped of my dignity. Today, it becomes a place where dignity is restored. Not just for me, but for every woman who's been silenced, every person of color who's been degraded by those sworn to protect them. The room fell into an eerie silence, the weight of her words settling on every person present. It wasn't just a statement of her own pain. It was a declaration of all the injustices she had fought against, all the wrongs she had endured, and the promise that they would no longer be tolerated. As she spoke, Riker's face, once filled with arrogance and bravado, began to drain of color. The smirk he had worn when he had tried to humiliate her disappeared, replaced by a look of pure fear. For the first time, he realized the full extent of the mistake he had made. His actions had been reckless and thoughtless, but in that moment, they were now facing the full force of accountability. He could no longer hide behind his badge or his position. The truth was out, and it had a name: Aaliyah Jefferson. She was not just the woman he had humiliated. She was now the judge who had the power to take everything from him. The power dynamics had shifted. The courtroom, once a place where Riker had wielded authority, had now become a place where Aaliyah's strength and resolve commanded respect. The weight of her transformation was evident. She had not only reclaimed her dignity, but she had taken control of the very system that had sought to strip her of it. Justice wasn't blind in this room. It was powerful, it was intentional, and it had come for Riker. The case continued, but it was clear. The man who had tried to break Aaliyah was now facing a reckoning. His excuses fell apart under the scrutiny of the law. He had no defense, no justification for the harm he had caused. His actions had been nothing more than cruelty disguised as authority. And in the end, the gavel fell. The room was filled with a moment of collective relief as Riker's misconduct was exposed for the world to see. He was stripped of his badge and sentenced for his civil rights violations. But the true victory wasn't in his punishment. It was in the fact that Aaliyah, who had once been broken by the very system that Riker had used to his advantage, had now risen above it. She had become the symbol of the very justice that had once been denied to her. Aaliyah's story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of transformation. She had taken the pain, the humiliation, and the loss, and turned it into a source of power. As the courtroom cleared, the weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air. Aaliyah had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had delivered it to every person who had been targeted, every person who had been dehumanized, and every person who had been denied their rightful place in the system. Her journey was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, there is a spark of resilience that can't be extinguished. And for Riker, that spark had become a wildfire. His arrogance had led him to this moment, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. But for Aaliyah, this moment was just another chapter in her journey, a journey that would continue, inspiring others to fight back against the injustices that sought to silence them. In that courtroom, Aaliyah had shown the world that dignity, justice, and power don't come from positions of authority or titles. They come from the strength to stand up, to speak the truth, and to never, ever give up. Aaliyah's journey didn't just change the trajectory of her life. It sparked a movement that rippled through the very heart of Chicago's legal system. Her rise, once seen as a miraculous act of defiance, soon turned into something far bigger, far more influential than anyone could have imagined. The courthouse, once an institution that stood as a monument to injustice, was forced to reckon with its own failings. After Aaliyah's powerful stand against Officer Riker and his cruelties, the courtroom adopted new protocols to prevent the kind of unnecessary humiliation that had once been inflicted upon detainees. Her fight had not only exposed corruption, but it had also lit a fire under the legal system, forcing it to be better, to be more accountable. Riker, The man who had once tried to erase her identity with clippers was now stripped of his badge and sentenced for civil rights violations. A quiet acknowledgement of the harm he had caused and the power Aaliyah had taken back from him. But even as this victory played out, Aaliyah wasn't done. She knew the battle for justice was far from over, and it wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about changing the system for everyone. That's when she launched Voices from the Bench, an initiative that aimed to give young women of color the chance to enter the legal world, not as victims, not as defendants, but as defenders of justice. The initiative was about more than just providing opportunities. It was about dismantling the barriers that had long kept Black women and women of color from having a voice in a system that had been so quick to silence them. And through it all, her shaved head, a symbol of her painful past, her suffering, but also her relentless strength, became a symbol of resistance. Worn proudly, it stood as a reminder that sometimes those who are most broken by the system are the ones who are meant to rebuild it. Aaliyah didn't just survive her hardships. She transformed them into a weapon of change, proving that the darkness she had endured was the very soil in which her power had grown. Her story, filled with pain, perseverance, and unimaginable power, was a testament to the human spirit's ability to rise from the ashes. It was a reminder that the system that tries to break people, that attempts to strip them of their dignity, can be the same system that is rebuilt by the strength of those it has wronged. Aaliyah Jefferson, with every step she took, with every challenge she overcame, showed the world that even in the darkest of courtrooms, there can still be a light. A light fueled by the unwavering determination of a woman who refused to give up. And in that light, she reminded us all that justice isn't just something that happens. It's something we build. It's something we fight for, even when the odds are stacked against us. And Aaliyah didn't just fight. She won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, degraded, or cast aside. She built a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As we reflect on Aaliyah Jefferson's incredible journey, we realize that her story isn't just about overcoming a personal humiliation. It's about the power to transform pain into purpose. Aaliyah's rise from victim to victor reminds us that even in the face of immense adversity, the human spirit can push through, change the course of history, and create a lasting impact. Her story teaches us that true strength isn't just in surviving. It's in using your experiences to break down barriers, challenge the status quo, and rebuild what was broken. But Aaliyah didn't just change her life, she changed the system, and her legacy proves that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that have been silenced the longest. If Aaliyah's story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you believe in the power of resilience and justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on more incredible stories that will leave you inspired and motivated to take action. Join the community, be part of the movement, and let's keep fighting for what's right, together.